In the bitter winter of 1708, across the frozen plains of Eastern Europe, the most feared army in the world found itself trapped in a nightmare of its own making. The Swedish Empire, once master of the Baltic Sea and commander of Europe's finest military machine, was about to discover that nature itself could become their deadliest enemy. This is the story of how the Great Frost shattered an empire, how tactical brilliance crumbled before the merciless cold, and how one king's ambition led his nation into a catastrophe so complete that Sweden would never again claim dominance over European battlefields. The year was 1700, and Sweden stood at the pinnacle of its power. The Baltic Sea had become a Swedish lake, its waters lapping against territories that stretched from Finland to the German coast. Stockholm commanded an empire that included Estonia, Livonia, Ingria, and vast swaths of northern Germany. Swedish soldiers in their magnificent blue uniforms with yellow facings were the envy of European armies, equipped with the latest flintlock muskets and the revolutionary socket bayonet that allowed them to fire while their weapons remained fixed for close combat. Their discipline was legendary, their tactics innovative, and their reputation for victory seemed unbreakable. Yet this very success had planted the seeds of Sweden's destruction. Every conquered territory, every strategic port, every mile of Baltic coastline had created enemies who burned with resentment, angered for revenge. Russia hung, under the ambitious Tsar Peter the Great, found its access to the Baltic blocked by Swedish fortresses. Denmark seethed over the loss of Scania and other territories to Swedish expansion. The German princes watched nervously as Swedish power grew within the Holy Roman Empire. Poland remembered when Livonia had been theirs. The web of enemies was vast, and they needed only the right moment to strike. That moment came in 1697 with the death of King Charles XI of Sweden. His heir, Charles XII, was merely 14 years old, a boy thrust onto the throne of Europe's most militarized state. To Sweden's enemies, he seemed the perfect target, a young ruler who could surely be overwhelmed before he learned to wield his inherited power. They could not have been more wrong about the character of the man they faced. The secret coalition formed in 1699 like a gathering storm. Tsar Peter of Russia, King Frederick IV of Denmark, and Augustus II of Saxony-Poland met in shadowed rooms to plan the dismemberment of the Swedish Empire. Each conspirator had his prize in mind. Frederick wanted Holstein-Gottorp, Augustus coveted Livonia and Lithuania, and Peter dreamed of Russian ships sailing freely on Baltic waters. They believed the young Swedish king would crumble under the weight of their combined assault. History would prove them catastrophically mistaken. Between January and August of 1700, the coalition struck. 3 declarations of war reached Stockholm as Sweden's enemies revealed their hand. But Charles XII was no ordinary teenage monarch. Athletic, intelligent, and possessed of an almost supernatural calm under pressure, he had been born for war. Where his enemies expected panic, they found precision. Where they anticipated chaos, they discovered a military mind that would soon become legend. The Danish campaign began Sweden's demonstration of how completely the coalition had misjudged their opponent. Charles moved with lightning speed, landing troops near Copenhagen and placing the Danish capital under siege. Trenches snaked toward the city walls, while Swedish cannons thundered day and night. King Frederick, racing back from campaigns in the south, found his kingdom on the brink of collapse. The Treaty of Travendel, signed in a complete August 1700, was Swedish triumph. Denmark was out of the war before the coalition had properly begun its offensive. With Denmark neutralized, Charles turned his attention eastward to where Peter the Great had begun besieging the fortress of Narva. The Russian Tsar commanded nearly 40,000 men, a massive force that dwarfed the Swedish relief army of barely 8,000 soldiers. By every measure of conventional military wisdom, the Russians should have crushed the approaching Swedes with overwhelming numbers. But Charles XII had already demonstrated that conventional wisdom meant nothing when faced with superior tactics, discipline, and timing. The Battle of Narva on November 30th, 1700, became the stuff of military legend. A driving snowstorm turned the battlefield into a white hell of swirling wind and blinding precipitation. Charles used the weather as his ally, launching his attack when visibility was at its worst. The Swedish charge came out of the storm like a blue and yellow avalanche, striking the Russian lines with such ferocity that panic spread faster than the snow. In just 30 minutes, The Swedish king had routed an army 4 times the size of his own, inflicting 8,000 casualties while losing only 700 men. Peter the Great himself barely escaped the catastrophe, leaving behind cannons, supplies, and the shattered remnants of what had been the largest army in the coalition. The victory at Narva sent shockwaves across Europe. The young Swedish king had not merely defeated his enemies, he had humiliated them so completely that their reputations lay in ruins alongside their armies. But Charles was far from finished. In 1701, he crossed into Courland, the strategic duchy that controlled vital trade routes between Poland and Russia. The crossing of the Düna became another masterpiece of Swedish military engineering and tactical innovation. The Allied commanders, Saxon General Otto Arnold von Pakull and Ferdinand Kettler of Courland, waited confidently behind their fortified positions along the river. They commanded 20,000 men in prepared defenses, facing a Swedish army of 14,000 across the water barrier. Kettler boasted that even 300,000 Swedes would not be enough to force a crossing against their positions. His confidence would prove as misplaced as that of every other commander who had underestimated the Swedish king. Charles ordered the construction of the first bridge across the Daugava River, an engineering marvel of anchored boats connected by ropes and timber. While his enemies watched from their earthworks, Swedish engineers worked through the night to create a pathway across the water. When dawn broke, the bridge was complete, and Charles led his men across in perfect formation. The coalition troops, so confident in their numbers and position just hours before, broke and fled as Swedish steel carved through their ranks. The city of Riga was saved, and all of Courland lay open to Swedish occupation. The occupation of Courland marked a crucial shift in Swedish strategy. The duchy became more than conquered territory. It became the foundation for extended operations against the coalition. Charles established winter quarters there, secured supply lines, and created a strategic chokehold on Polish trade routes. From Courland, Swedish forces could threaten multiple fronts simultaneously while maintaining the logistics necessary for prolonged campaigning. The duchy's ports provided access for Swedish reinforcements and supplies, while its position allowed Charles to coordinate attacks on both Russian and Saxon forces. Yet even as Swedish victories mounted, a larger strategic challenge was emerging. Charles had won every battle, but the war itself was expanding beyond what any single army could control. While he crushed his enemies in direct combat, the sheer geographic scope of the conflict was beginning to strain even Sweden's remarkable military machine. The coalition members might flee from Swedish charges, but they possessed something Charles lacked: the ability to absorb massive losses and continue fighting. The stage was being set for a confrontation that would test not just Swedish military prowess, but the very limits of what one brilliant king and his magnificent army could achieve against the vast resources of the Russian Empire. The Polish campaign that followed would showcase both the heights of Charles's tactical genius and the first signs of the strategic trap that was slowly closing around Sweden. In 1702, the young king launched an audacious march across the entire Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, his army cutting through the vast territory like a blue and yellow sword. From north to south, Swedish forces occupied Wilno, Warsaw, and Krakow in a display of mobility that left their enemies gasping. The Polish cavalry, once the terror of European battlefields, met their match at Klisau on June 19th, where Charles shattered their ranks in a single decisive engagement. But Augustus the Strong proved more slippery than his broken cavalry. While Charles celebrated victory on the battlefield, the Saxon king had already begun a roundabout retreat toward Pomerania, using the vast distances of Eastern Europe to avoid another direct confrontation. The Swedes found themselves masters of Polish cities, but chasing shadows across endless plains. Each victory brought new territory to control, new supply lines to protect, and fewer men available for the decisive blow that would end the war. Charles responded to this challenge with characteristic boldness. If Augustus would not stand and fight, then Charles would create political chaos that would force his hand. In 1704, Swedish gold and Swedish pressure produced the Confederation faction of Warsaw, a Polish that elevated Stanisław Leszczyński to the throne in place of Augustus. The Commonwealth split between two rival confederations, with the pro-Saxon Sandomierz faction relying heavily on Russian auxiliaries, while the pro-Swedish Warsaw Confederation looked to Stockholm for support. The political maneuvering worked brilliantly in the short term. Augustus found his position in Poland crumbling as noble families switched sides or remained neutral, waiting to see which king would ultimately triumph. But the strategy came with a hidden cost that would prove devastating. By creating a puppet ruler in Poland, Charles had committed Sweden to maintaining that ruler against all challengers. Swedish resources that should have been concentrated against Russia were instead scattered across Polish territories, defending Leszczyński's precarious throne. The war of attrition that followed played directly into Russian hands. While Charles maneuvered his army across Poland and Saxony, Peter the Great was rebuilding his military machine from the ground up. The humiliation at Narva had taught the Tsar valuable lessons about Swedish tactics and the weakness of Russian arms. He began systematic reforms that would transform his ramshackle forces into a modern army capable of standing against Swedish steel. Russian forces, no longer seeking direct confrontation with Charles's main army, began a campaign of devastation in Swedish territories. Livonia, the jewel of Sweden's Baltic Empire, suffered terribly as Russian columns burned estates, destroyed crops, and drove away livestock. The Swedish defenders, outnumbered and unable to concentrate their forces, fought a desperate series of delaying actions that cost them dearly. Each Russian raid weakened Sweden's economic foundation, while Peter's army grew stronger and more confident. Charles, recognizing that the Polish stalemate was bleeding his empire dry, made the fateful decision to march directly into Saxony itself. In 1706, his army crossed into Augustus's hereditary lands, bringing Swedish warfare to the very heart of German territory. The campaign was swift and merciless. Saxon forces, already demoralized by years of defeat, offered only token resistance as Swedish columns advanced toward Dresden. The Treaty of Altenstadt, signed in September 1706, appeared to vindicate Charles's aggressive strategy. Augustus formally renounced the Polish throne, recognizing Leszczyński as the legitimate king. He agreed to break his alliance with Russia and even handed over Johann Reinhold Patkul, the Livonian nobleman who had helped organize the original anti-Swedish coalition. Patkul's execution sent a clear message about the price of opposing Swedish power. Yet even in triumph, the seeds of disaster were taking root. The years spent campaigning in Poland and Saxony had cost Sweden irreplaceable time and resources. While Charles celebrated political victory, Peter the Great had used the respite to continue his military reforms. Russian forces had grown in number, improved in equipment, and gained invaluable experience in their devastating raids against Swedish territories. The balance of power was shifting, but Charles remained focused on the immediate tactical picture rather than the broader strategic transformation occurring across Eastern Europe. The young Swedish king faced a terrible choice. He could return to Stockholm with his political victories intact, leaving Peter free to rebuild and resume the war at a time of Russian choosing. Or he could press forward with a direct invasion of Russia, seeking the decisive battle that would finally crush his most dangerous enemy. For a warrior king who had never known defeat, who had humiliated every army that dared face him, the choice seemed obvious. The decision to invade Russia in 1708 would transform Charles from Europe's most successful military commander into a cautionary tale of overreach and hubris. 7 years of continuous warfare had proven that no satisfactory verdict could be achieved without striking at the heart of Russian power. Peter the Great had shown he could absorb massive losses, rebuild his armies, and continue fighting as long as Moscow remained secure. Charles began his preparations in the winter of 1707, assembling an army of nearly 44,000 men in Saxony. This force represented the flower of Swedish military power, veterans hardened by years of campaigning and equipped with the finest weapons European industry could produce. Their uniforms might be patched and weathered, but their discipline remained unshaken, their confidence absolute. They had followed their king across half of Europe, and they trusted him to lead them to one final, decisive victory. The march eastward began on August 22, 1707, as the Swedish army left its comfortable quarters in Saxony and headed into the unknown vastness of Russia. The soldiers sang as they marched, their voices carrying across the German countryside in the ancient songs of their homeland. They were heading toward the greatest test of their lives, though none could have imagined the frozen hell that awaited them in the endless expanses of the Russian winter. The invasion route stretched before them like a pathway into legend. Charles crossed the Vistula River on Christmas Day 1707, his army moving through hostile Masuria, where Polish eyes watched from darkened windows and Polish hearts prayed for Swedish defeat. The fortress city of Grodno, fell on January 26, 1708, abandoned by Russian forces who melted away before the Swedish advance like morning mist before the rising Sunday. Each captured town, each abandoned position, seemed to confirm that Peter the Great was repeating the same strategy that had failed so catastrophically at Narva. The Russians were retreating, and Charles was pursuing them toward what he believed would be their final destruction. But as the Swedish columns pressed deeper into Russian territory, they began to encounter something far more dangerous than enemy armies. The Russians had learned from their earlier defeats, and Peter's generals had devised a strategy that turned Russia's greatest weakness into its most potent weapon. The vastness that had once made the empire difficult to defend now became an instrument of war itself. Russian armies did not stand and fight where Charles could destroy them with superior tactics and discipline. Instead, they withdrew continuously into the endless expanse of their homeland, leaving behind them a landscape stripped of everything the Swedish army needed to survive. The scorched-earth policy that emerged was devastating in its thoroughness. As Russian forces retreated, they drove away cattle, burned standing crops, and destroyed grain stores that had fed local populations for generations. Mills were torn down, bridges collapsed, and wells were poisoned or filled with stones. Villages that had stood for centuries became empty shells, their populations fleeing eastward with whatever possessions they could carry. The Swedish army found themselves marching through a land that seemed cursed, where every farm had been reduced to blackened timber and every field had been turned to ash. Charles pressed forward despite the growing supply crisis. His confidence remained unshaken, his determination absolute. He had faced desperate situations before and emerged victorious through speed, aggression, and tactical brilliance. The Russian strategy of retreat and devastation was surely a sign of weakness, a desperate attempt to avoid the decisive battle that would end the war in Sweden's favor. Each mile eastward brought him closer to Moscow, closer to forcing Peter to stand and fight, closer to the victory that would crown his military career with immortal glory. Meanwhile, Russian columns began a deadly game of harassment that wore away Swedish strength like water-eroding stone. They struck at supply convoys, ambushed foraging parties, and attacked isolated detachments before melting away into the forests and swamps. Swedish soldiers who had grown accustomed to crushing their enemies in open battle found themselves facing an enemy they could rarely see and never quite catch. The constant threat of attack meant that every march became a tactical movement, every rest stop required defensive preparations, and every decision had to account for invisible enemies who might strike from any direction. The psychological toll of this campaign began to show in the Swedish ranks. Veterans who had charged Russian earthworks at Narva now looked nervously at every tree line, wondering what might be lurking in the shadows. The easy victories of earlier campaigns seemed like memories from another lifetime as the army struggled through increasingly hostile territory. Supply shortages meant smaller rations, which meant less strength for the grueling marches. Horses began to die from exhaustion and lack of fodder, forcing soldiers to carry equipment that had previously been transported by animals. As autumn deepened into winter, Charles made the fateful decision that would seal his army's doom. The direct route to Moscow had become impossible as Russian forces concentrated to defend their capital. Supply lines stretched back hundreds of miles through devastated territory where every mile was contested by enemy raiders. The Swedish king needed winter quarters where his men could rest, resupply, and prepare for the final push that would bring victory in the spring. Ivan Mazepa, hetman of the Zaporizhian Cossacks, offered what seemed like salvation. His territories in Ukraine could provide the winter base that Charles desperately needed, along with the promise of Cossack warriors to reinforce the Swedish army. The alliance seemed perfect, a partnership between two leaders who shared a common enemy in Russian imperialism. Mazepa brought legitimacy to the Swedish cause and knowledge of local terrain that could prove invaluable in future campaigns. The march south toward Ukraine began in October 1708, as the first snows began to fall across the Russian landscape. Charles led his army away from the direct Moscow route and into what he believed would be friendly territory, where supplies and reinforcements awaited. The Cossack alliance promised to transform the strategic situation, providing Charles with local allies who knew the land and could fight the kind of irregular warfare that had plagued his advance. But as the Swedish army moved deeper into Ukraine, the weather began to reveal its true character. The first snows were followed by harder storms, then by cold so intense that it seemed to burn the lungs of anyone foolish enough to venture outside without proper protection. Trees cracked like musket shots in the freezing air. Rivers that had flowed for millennia became solid highways of ice, thick enough to support artillery. The very air seemed to turn solid, hanging in crystalline clouds around the breath of men and horses alike. This was no ordinary winter. Across Europe, from London to Moscow, temperatures plummeted to levels not seen in living memory. The Thames froze solid enough for markets to operate on its surface. Wine froze in cellars throughout France. Even the Mediterranean grew cold enough that snow fell on regions that had not seen winter weather in decades. Scientists would later call it the Great Frost, the coldest European winter in 5 centuries, a climatic catastrophe that struck at the worst possible moment for Charles and his army. The Swedish soldiers, veterans of Scandinavian winters, found themselves facing conditions that exceeded anything in their experience. Sentries froze to death at their posts, dying so quietly that they were found still standing at attention with ice crystals coating their uniforms. Horses collapsed and died in their tracks, their bodies becoming frozen obstacles that had to be chopped apart and moved aside so the army could continue its march. Supply wagons became trapped in snowdrifts so deep that entire teams of men were needed to dig them free. On a single night in January 1709, as the Great Frost reached its most savage intensity, over 2,000 Swedish soldiers died without a single enemy shot being fired. They simply froze to death where they lay, their blankets becoming shrouds of ice, their breath stopping in clouds that crystallized and fell like diamonds to the frozen ground. The survivors woke to find themselves surrounded by the bodies of their comrades, faces peaceful in death but turned blue-white by the killing cold. The army that had once been the terror of European battlefields was being destroyed not by Russian steel but by the merciless fury of nature itself. Charles watched his magnificent military machine crumble day by day, hour by hour, as the cold claimed victims with a ruthlessness that exceeded any human enemy. The blue and yellow uniforms that had once struck fear into the hearts of enemies now served as colorful markers in the white landscape, identifying where another Swedish soldier had fallen to the implacable advance of winter. Desperate for shelter, Swedish detachments fought savage battles for control of any structure that could provide protection from the wind. Villages became contested battlegrounds where Swedish and Russian forces killed each other for the privilege of dying indoors rather than in the open. Churches, barns, even animal shelters became precious beyond measure, worth any price in blood to secure. The few buildings that offered refuge were packed so tightly with soldiers that men slept standing up, pressed together for warmth, while others stood guard against enemies who were fighting the same battle for survival. Artillery pieces, the pride of Swedish military engineering, became useless burdens as gunpowder froze solid, and metal became so brittle that it shattered at the slightest impact. Cannons that had battered down fortress walls were abandoned in snowdrifts, their bronze barrels destined to remain buried until spring revealed the magnitude of the disaster. Muskets became clubs when the firing mechanisms froze, and even swords became dangerous to wield as metal cold enough to burn exposed flesh could injure the wielder as easily as the enemy. By spring 1709, the Swedish army that had entered Russia as conquerors had been reduced to barely 20,000 survivors. These were not the disciplined veterans who had followed their king across Europe, but hollow-eyed scarecrows dressed in rags and held together by desperation and loyalty to Charles. They had lost more men to the cold than to 7 years of continuous warfare. The Great Frost had accomplished what no enemy army had managed to achieve, breaking the back of Swedish military power and leaving Charles with a force too small to threaten anyone. Yet even in this desperate situation, the Swedish king refused to acknowledge defeat. He had come too far and sacrificed too much to turn back now. Somewhere ahead lay the fortress of Poltava, and beyond that the possibility of redemption. The cold had nearly destroyed his army, but Charles still believed that one decisive victory could restore everything he had lost. The trap that had been closing around Sweden for nearly a decade was about to spring shut, but the young king, who had never known defeat, was determined to fight until the very end. The frozen wastes of Ukraine had claimed the greatest army Europe had ever seen, but Charles XII would not surrender to fate. His march toward Poltava became the final act of a tragedy written in ice and blood, where Swedish dreams of empire would meet their end on a battlefield that history would never forget. The Great Frost had shattered more than an army. It had broken the spine of Swedish power and transformed the balance of European politics forever. From the ashes of that catastrophe, Russia would rise as the new master of the North, while Sweden's blue and yellow banners would never again strike terror into the hearts of enemies. Sometimes the greatest victories belong not to the strongest armies, but to those patient enough to let winter fight their battles for them.